The morning fog rolled in from Monterey Bay like a gray blanket, muffling the sounds of the harbor and casting everything in that familiar coastal haze that made the world feel smaller, quieter. Elena Briggs sat in her beat-up Honda Civic outside the Alameda County Municipal Courthouse, watching seagulls wheel overhead while the engine ticked as it cooled. At 42, she had the kind of weather beauty that spoke of too much sun and too many sleepless nights. Her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, green eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings without effort. She wore what she always wore: faded Levi's soft from years of washing, scuffed running shoes that had walked more miles than most people drove, and a black zip-up hoodie that hung loose on her small frame. To anyone passing by, she looked like just another person dealing with the grinding machinery of local government. Maybe someone behind on bills, maybe a property dispute, maybe nothing more complicated than a traffic violation. But Elena wasn't here by choice. She was here because the VA Housing Review Board had flagged her address change, which had triggered a review of her disability status, which had led to a request for updated documentation, which had somehow resulted in a missed court date for a parking citation she'd never received. The kind of administrative cascade that could swallow weeks of your life if you weren't careful. This was her fourth trip to a government building in the past 2 months. First, the VA regional office in Oakland, where a clerk had informed her that her disability rating was under review because someone had flagged her address change as suspicious. Then the county assessor's office, where she'd spent 3 hours in plastic chairs waiting to prove she lived where she said she lived. Then back to the VA, where a different clerk had told her she needed court documentation to verify her housing status. Each visit had generated more paperwork, more appointments, more opportunities for the system to lose track of her existence. She'd driven 3 hours from her place near Monterey, a converted shipping container on a friend's property, where she paid $200 a month, and nobody asked questions about the nights she woke up shouting or the days she couldn't get out of bed. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. And quiet had become the most valuable thing in her life. The courthouse squatted like a concrete bunker 3 blocks from the naval station, its beige walls stained with decades of coastal fog and exhaust fumes. The morning air carried the sharp bite of salt from the bay mixed with diesel from the truck route, and that particular smell of old government buildings, floor wax, burnt coffee, and the ghost of 1,000 nervous conversations. Elena stepped out slowly, deliberately. Her movements had that economy of motion that comes from years of making every gesture count, every step calculated. She checked her phone once, slipped it into her back pocket, and pulled a manila envelope from the passenger seat. The envelope was creased from handling, stamped and dated, containing forms that should have been simple to file, but had somehow become a bureaucratic nightmare. The courthouse lobby smelled like disinfectant and stale cigarettes, despite the no-smoking signs posted every 10 feet. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that institutional greenish glow that made healthy people look sick and sick people look dead. Behind the information desk, a clerk with tired eyes and a badge that read Mrs. Patterson was sorting through a stack of files while simultaneously fielding phone calls from people who clearly didn't understand that she couldn't solve their problems over the phone. Help you? Patterson looked up as Elena approached, her expression already sliding into that professional indifference government workers perfected after their first year. Elena placed the envelope on the counter, noting how Patterson's eyes briefly took in her appearance. The worn clothing, the lack of jewelry, the general air of someone who wasn't going to be a high-maintenance case. I'm here for the Briggs case. VA documentation review. Patterson's fingers moved across her keyboard with practiced efficiency, pecking at keys while keeping half her attention on Elena and half on the phone that kept ringing every 30 seconds. Elena Briggs. You missed your court date. Judge issued a bench warrant. The words hung in the air between them. Elena's expression didn't change. I was never notified of a court date. Says here you were served at your address of record. Patterson turned her monitor slightly, showing a screen full of case numbers and dates. You need to speak with the bailiff about warrant resolution. That's when Sergeant Mike Kowalski appeared from the side hallway. All 230 pounds of him moving with the purposeful stride of someone who'd spent 20 years in county corrections before taking this job. He wore his uniform tight across his chest, duty belt loaded with the tools of courthouse authority, and carried himself with the kind of swagger that came from never having been seriously challenged. Elena Briggs. His voice carried across the lobby, turning heads. You're coming with me. Elena looked at Patterson, then at Kowalski. I'm here to file paperwork. Yeah, well, you can file it from lockup. Failure to appear means you get processed. First, paperwork second. That's how it works. He gestured toward her hands. Turn around. Elena stood perfectly still for a moment, calculating. She could explain, could tell him about the VA mess, the address change, the notification that never came. Could mention that she'd driven 3 hours just to sort this out. That she had all the documentation right there in the envelope. Instead, she simply turned around and put her hands behind her back. The handcuffs clicked into place with that distinctive metallic sound that made everyone in the lobby stop what they were doing. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Cell phone calls were interrupted. Even the clerk looked up from her files, suddenly interested in the small drama unfolding at her desk. Parking citation, Kowalski announced to the room, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who'd successfully imposed order on chaos. Lady thinks she can just ignore the courts. Show up whenever she feels like it. But as Elena stood there, wrists bound, something flickered in her eyes. Not anger, not fear, but something deeper. Something that spoke of experiences in places where handcuffs were the least of your worries, where staying calm under pressure meant the difference between life and death. And in that moment, watching the small crowd of courthouse observers shake their heads in judgment, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't resist. She wouldn't argue. She would let the system reveal itself, one mistake at a time, until the truth had nowhere left to hide. Courtroom 2B was smaller than Elena had expected, with maybe 30 seats divided by a center aisle and a raised bench where Judge Hal Brennan presided over the morning's collection of traffic violations, small claims disputes, and municipal code violations. Brennan was in his early 60s, silver-haired and soft around the middle, with the kind of tired authority that came from processing thousands of minor infractions over decades on the bench. Kowalski positioned Elena in front of the bench, still cuffed, while a scattered collection of other defendants, lawyers, and courthouse staff filled the gallery behind them. In the back row, 2 young officers from the local JAG office, Lieutenant Commander Patricia Walsh and Lieutenant Joey Masterson, were reviewing files for their next case, their conversation a low murmur punctuated by the occasional shuffle of papers. Elena Briggs, case number 4-2-7-1B, Judge Brennan announced, looking up from his file. Failure to appear on municipal citation. Violation of Parking Ordinance 15.2.7. Outstanding fine of $240 plus court costs. Elena straightened slightly, her posture unconsciously shifting to attention. The movement was subtle, but it carried the kind of discipline that came from years of military bearing. Your Honor, I never received any notification. I've been dealing with a VA address change. That's not the court's concern. Brennan interrupted, his voice carrying the impatience of someone who'd heard similar explanations 100 times that week. You're responsible for maintaining current contact information. The warrant was properly issued. Behind them, Walsh leaned over to Masterson. "Another one of those disability cases," she whispered. "They think missing court dates doesn't matter because they've got PTSD or whatever." Masterson nodded, looking up from his file. "Always got an excuse. I never got the notice. I was in the hospital. My therapist said, ... single quotes, gets old after a while." Their voices were just loud enough to carry to the front of the courtroom. Elena's shoulders tensed almost imperceptibly, but she kept her eyes forward, her breathing steady. She'd heard worse, in places where words could get you killed. This was just another kind of battlefield. Given the failure to appear and the outstanding fine, Judge Brennan continued, "I'm ordering you remanded to county holding until the amount can be paid or a payment plan established." He banged his gavel once, that sharp crack echoing through the small courtroom. "Next case." Kowalski touched Elena's elbow, preparing to escort her out when something happened that nobody expected. As she turned to follow him, the handcuffs pulled her arms back slightly, causing her hoodie sleeves to ride up. Not much, maybe an inch or two, but enough to expose the inside of her left forearm. There, just below her wrist, were 9 small marks etched into the skin. Precise, deliberate, burned into flesh rather than tattooed. Each mark was about an inch long, perfectly parallel, and spaced exactly a 1/4 inch apart. They looked like hash marks a prisoner might make on a cell wall, counting days. But these weren't counting time. They were counting lives. Lieutenant Commander Walsh stopped mid-sentence, her file forgotten in her lap. She'd spent 6 years as a Navy intelligence analyst before law school, and she'd seen marks like those before in classified briefings, in after-action reports that were buried so deep they technically didn't exist. The kind of documents that came with security clearances that had their own security clearances. "Holy shit," she whispered, her face going pale. Masterson looked up from his paperwork, annoyed at the interruption. "What?" "Those marks on her arm." Walsh's voice was barely audible, but there was something in it that made everyone nearby strain to listen. "I've seen those before. What are you talking about?" Walsh stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on Elena's forearm as Kowalski continued to escort her toward the side door. The marks were clearly visible now, stark against her pale skin, each one a precise reminder of something most people would never understand. They weren't random. They weren't decorative. They were methodical, purposeful, burned into flesh with the kind of precision that spoke of military discipline. "SEAL Overwatch Protocol," Walsh said, her voice gaining strength as the pieces fell into place. "Confirmed kills over 800 yards." They weren't supposed to mark them, but some of the Tier 1 operators did it anyway. Off the books, the courtroom was still moving around them. The judge calling the next case, other defendants shifting in their seats, lawyers conferring with clients in urgent whispers. But in the back row, a small pocket of stunned silence was growing as Walsh pulled out her phone. "Are you sure?" Masterson leaned forward, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by something that looked like growing concern. "I wrote intelligence summaries on those operations when I was stationed at Special Operations Command." Walsh's fingers were already moving across her phone screen, accessing databases that weren't supposed to exist. "We had a sniper, call sign Overwatch 7, who worked with SEAL Team 6 in Yemen and Somalia. Off-books operations, Tier 0 stuff. A few taps, a security code, access to files that 3 people in Washington had clearance to read." Walsh's face went white as she found what she was looking for. "Overwatch 7, she whispered, reading from the screen. "Elena Briggs. Killed in action, 2012. She looked up, her eyes tracking Elena's path toward the exit. Except she's standing right there. The weight of that realization settled over the small group like a blanket. Elena Briggs, the woman they just watched get handcuffed and humiliated. The woman Kowalski had dismissed as another deadbeat trying to dodge responsibility was officially dead. Had been officially dead for over a decade, which meant everything they thought they knew about her was wrong. And in a building full of people trained to evaluate evidence and make judgments, nobody had bothered to ask the most important question. Of all, who was she really? The courthouse holding area was exactly what Elena had expected. A long wooden bench behind, a low partition with a clipboard bolted to the wall for intake paperwork. No bars, no privacy, just a place to wait while the system decided what to do with you. The bench was scarred with decades of nervous fidgeting, carved with initials and phone numbers from people who'd sat in this exact spot, wondering how their day had gone so wrong. Elena sat with the same quiet composure she'd maintained throughout. The hearing, her hands now uncuffed and resting calmly in her lap. The marks on her forearm were still visible, catching the fluorescent light from overhead. She didn't try to hide them, didn't pull her sleeves down, just sat there, patient as stone, waiting for whatever came next. This wasn't her first time being processed by a system that didn't understand her, and she'd learned long ago that resistance only made things worse. The trick was to stay calm, stay focused, and let the bureaucracy reveal its own contradictions. Eventually, someone would ask the right questions. Eventually, someone would see past the surface. Across the hallway, Walsh was making phone calls. Urgent, whispered conversations with people who answered after one ring and spoke in careful, measured tones. Intelligence contacts, old supervisors, people who might remember a sniper who'd officially died in a building collapse in Yemen, but might have survived something that never made it into any official report. This is Commander Walsh, former intelligence analyst, SOCOM. I need verification on a keyer from 20-12... Yes, I'll hold. Elena could hear fragments of the conversations, but her expression never changed. She'd learned long ago that the past had a way of catching up with you, no matter how carefully you tried to bury it. The trick was not to resist. When it happened, just let it wash over you and keep breathing. Kowalski stood near the entrance, his earlier confidence replaced by something that looked like growing unease. He'd processed thousands of defendants over the years, and he'd developed a sixth sense for reading people. The dangerous ones, the broken ones, the ones who were all bluster and no substance. But Elena didn't fit any of those categories. She sat there like someone who'd learned patience in places where impatience could get you killed. Commander? A voice crackled through Walsh's secure phone. We found the file. Overwatch 7, Elena Briggs. Operation Copper Rain, Yemen, 2012. Building collapse, presumed Kier. But ... But what? There's a notation here. Recovery team never found the body. Just blood and gear. File was sealed and classified above our level. I can't access the details, but someone higher up marked it as active pending final verification. Walsh felt her stomach drop. Active pending final verification was military speak for we think they might still be alive, but we can't prove it. It was the kind of classification that got attached to operators who disappeared in places where normal rules didn't apply. There's more, the voice continued. I'm looking at her service record. 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan, 18 months in Yemen attached to JSOC, Navy Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device. This woman has more confirmed kills than most entire units. Walsh hung up and stared at Elena through the holding area partition. The quiet woman sitting patiently on the bench, wearing worn jeans and a faded hoodie, had spent years in some of the most dangerous places on Earth, had saved lives, taken lives, and officially died in service to her country. And now she was being held on a packing ticket. We need to call the base, Walsh said to Masterson, her voice tight with something between horror and embarrassment. We need to call Admiral Thorne at Naval Special Warfare Command. Right now. Masterson was already reaching for his phone. What do I tell him? Tell him we found a ghost. Tell him Overwatch 7 is sitting in our courthouse, and we just processed her like a common criminal. Walsh's training was kicking in now, the analytical mind that had once parsed intelligence. From war zones now focused on understanding how badly they'd screwed up. Tell him we need damage control, and we need it now. But as they scrambled to make calls and access classified databases, Elena remained perfectly still. She'd been through worse bureaucratic nightmares, survived worse misunderstandings. The system would eventually sort itself out. It always did. The question was how much collateral damage would be done in the process. And sitting there in the holding area, listening to the growing panic and the voices around her, Elena allowed herself a small, bitter smile. She'd spent years learning to be invisible, to blend into the background, to be just another face in the crowd. But invisibility, she was learning, came with its own set of problems. Especially when the people around you suddenly realized you weren't supposed to exist. Admiral Marcus Thorne was reviewing intelligence briefings in his office at Naval Special Warfare Command when his secure phone rang. At 67, he still carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd spent 3 decades in special operations, his dress whites adorned with ribbons that told stories of deployments to places that didn't appear on any map. The Navy Cross gleamed among them, along with 3 bronze stars and a Purple Heart that suggested he'd paid for his authority in blood. Admiral, this is Lieutenant Commander Walsh, JAG Corps, Alameda County Courthouse. Sir, we have a situation that requires immediate attention. Thorne set down his briefing folder. Walsh's voice carried the kind of controlled urgency that meant someone had stepped on a landmine. What kind of situation, Commander? Sir, we have a woman in custody on a parking violation. Elena Briggs. She's supposed to be dead. The name hit Thorne like a physical blow. Elena Briggs. Overwatch 7. The sniper who'd held Overwatch position on Operation Copper Rain when everything went to hell. The woman who'd stayed on station in a collapsing building, talking her team through the extraction on a radio, held together with medical tape and willpower. Where is she now? His voice carried the weight of command decisions made under fire, of situations where hesitation meant people died. Courthouse holding, sir. She was processed on a failure to appear warrant. The bailiff handcuffed her, and Walsh's voice faltered. Sir, nobody recognized her. Nobody knew who she was. She's been treated like a common criminal. Thorne was already reaching for his cap. I'm en route. And Commander? Nobody moves her. Nobody processes her. Nobody so much as looks at her wrong. Until I get there. Yes, sir. And Commander? This conversation never happened. The woman in your holding area doesn't exist until I say she does. Are we clear? Crystal clear, sir. 20 minutes later, the courthouse's main entrance doors opened with a sound like controlled thunder. Admiral Thorne entered with the kind of presence that shifted the atmospheric pressure of a room. Behind him, 2 junior officers struggled to keep pace, their own uniforms crisp, but somehow diminished by proximity to the Admiral's authority. One carried a briefcase that bore the seal of Naval Special Warfare Command. The other clutched a secure phone that had been buzzing every 30 seconds since they'd left the base. The lobby conversations died as he passed. Clerks looked up from their desks, suddenly aware that someone important had entered their domain. Lawyers paused mid-conversation with clients, recognizing command presence when they saw it. Even the security guard straightened unconsciously, responding to something in his bearing that demanded attention without asking for it. Mrs. Patterson actually stood up behind her desk, an honor she hadn't accorded anyone since the last time a federal judge had visited. Can I help you, Admiral? I need to speak with whoever's holding Elena Briggs. His voice carried the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. Patterson's fingers flew across her keyboard, suddenly motivated to work faster than she had all morning. "Sir, she's in holding pending. I don't care what she's pending. Get me to her, now." The word, now, carried the weight of command decisions made under fire, of situations where hesitation meant people died. Patterson stood immediately, gesturing toward the hallway that led to the courtrooms. Thorne found Elena exactly where he expected to, sitting calmly on the holding bench, her hands folded, her face composed. When she saw him, she stood slowly, coming to attention without the formal rigidity of a parade ground, just the unconscious straightening that came from muscle. Memory older than civilian life. "Admiral," she said quietly. "Elena." His voice was gentler now, but still carried the authority that had brought him across the building. "They told me you were dead." "I was supposed to be." He nodded, understanding flowing between them, and the kind of shorthand that only came from shared experience in places where normal rules didn't apply. Then he turned to address the small crowd that had gathered. Courthouse staff, the JAG officers, Judge Brennan, who had emerged from his courtroom to see what the commotion was about. "Does anyone in this building know who this woman is?" His voice carried across the hallway, cutting through the ambient noise of courthouse business. "Anyone know what she's done?" Silence. The kind of complete quiet that only came when people suddenly realized they might be in the presence of something they didn't understand. "She's the sniper who held Overwatch on Operation Copper Rain, Yemen, 2012. Thorne's voice carried the weight of someone who'd been there, who'd seen the aftermath, who'd helped pull bodies from concrete and twisted steel. She was positioned on a 6-story building with clear sight lines to 3 extraction points when it took a direct hit. From an RPG, building collapsed. We found her in the rubble 18 hours later, still alive, still conscious, still talking her team through the extraction on a radio that should have been destroyed in the collapse." Judge Brennan stepped forward, his earlier authority replaced by something that looked like embarrassment mixed with genuine horror. "Admiral, we had no way of knowing. You had every way of knowing. It's called asking. It's called treating people with basic human dignity instead of processing them like paperwork." Thorne's eyes swept the gathered crowd, taking in faces that ranged from shame to curiosity to genuine remorse. It's called recognizing that the person standing in front of you might have stories you can't imagine. The hallway had grown completely silent now. Even the ambient courthouse noise seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Kowalski stood frozen near the holding area entrance, his face pale, realizing that the woman he'd handcuffed and humiliated had earned more respect in one day than he'd shown in his entire career. And in that moment, watching the recognition dawn on their faces, Elena understood that her carefully constructed invisibility was about to come to an end. The quiet life she'd built, the anonymity she'd cultivated, the simple existence that had kept her sane for over a decade, all of it was about to change. Because sometimes the past doesn't just catch up with you. Sometimes it arrives with an admiral and a briefcase full of classified documents, demanding that the world finally acknowledge what you've always known, that heroes don't always look like what people expect them to look like. Elena stood quietly through the entire exchange, her expression unchanged. When Thorne finished speaking, she stepped forward slightly, her voice carrying the same calm authority that had once guided 43 American service members through hostile territory. "Admiral, I appreciate this, but I just came here to file my paperwork. That's all I wanted." The simplicity of her statement hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Here was a woman who'd earned the Navy Cross, who'd saved dozens of lives, who'd been officially dead for over a decade, and all she wanted was to file VA paperwork. The mundane bureaucracy that had brought her here seemed almost obscene in the face of her service record. Thorne studied her face for a moment, seeing Something there that the others missed. The kind of weariness that came not from physical exhaustion, but from carrying weight that couldn't be set down. What kind of paperwork? Via housing review. They flagged my address change. Needed updated documentation. She gestured toward. The manila envelope still tucked under her arm. Same bureaucratic shuffle that's been going on for 10 years. Lieutenant Commander Walsh stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment. Ma'am, I'm the one who recognized your marks. I should have spoken up sooner. I should have. You did fine, Commander. Elena's voice carried no anger, no resentment. Just the exhausted patience of someone who'd been through this kind of recognition before. The system works the way it works. You can't change that. But Thorne wasn't willing to let it go. He turned to Judge Brennan, his voice carrying a note. A finality that left no room for argument. This proceeding is dismissed. All charges dropped, all fines waived. And if any part of this appears in her record, I'll have it expunged by close of business today. Brennan nodded quickly. Of course, Admiral. Absolutely. And Judge? Thorne's voice carried a warning that made everyone in the hallway straighten. The next time someone walks into your courtroom, maybe ask yourself if you know their story before you decide what they deserve. Kowalski had remained silent throughout the exchange, his face growing paler with each revelation. Now he stepped forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Ma'am, I'm sorry. I didn't know. If I'd known, you did your job, Elena interrupted, her tone neither forgiving nor condemning. You processed a warrant. That's what you're supposed to do. But her words carried an undertone that made Kowalski flinch, because they both knew. He'd done more than process a warrant. He'd made assumptions, drawn conclusions, treated her like every other defendant who'd failed to appear. And in doing so, he'd revealed something ugly about the system they all worked within. The marks on your arm, Walsh said quietly. Are they real? Are they what I think they are? Elena looked down at her forearm, where the 9 precise scars were still visible beneath her pushed-up sleeve. They're real, but they're not what you think they are. What do you mean? They're not kill marks. They're save marks. Elena's voice carried the weight of memory, of decisions made in places where right and wrong were measured in heartbeats and blood. Each one represents a life I managed to save. A teammate who made it home because I was watching their back. The distinction hit the crowd like a revelation. They assumed the marks were about death, about killing, about the dark side of military service. But they were about life, about protection, about the most fundamental duty of anyone who'd ever worn the uniform, bringing your people home. 9 saves, Thorne said quietly. That's not counting Copper Rain. That's not counting the 43 lives you saved when the building came down. Those weren't planned, Elena replied. Those were just ... what happened. These are the ones where I had a choice, where I could have taken the shot or held back and I chose to save instead of eliminate. Judge Brennan was staring at her with something approaching awe. Ma'am, we owe you an apology. All of us. The way you were treated today is how veterans get treated every day, Elena finished. In courtrooms, in government offices, in every place where someone in uniform decides who deserves respect and who doesn't. I'm not special. I'm just the one who got recognized. The truth of that statement settled over the hallway like a shroud, because everyone there knew she was right. They'd all seen veterans processed through the system, dismissed, diminished, reduced to case numbers and file folders. The only difference was that this time, someone had cared enough to look deeper. What happens now? Walsh asked. Elena was already walking toward the exit, her envelope clutched in one hand, her other hand unconsciously pulling down her sleeve to cover the marks that had started this whole encounter. Now I go file my paperwork, and you all go back to your jobs. And maybe tomorrow, when the next veteran walks through those doors, someone remembers that heroes don't always look like what you expect them to look like. She paused at the courthouse doors, looking back at the assembled crowd. The parking ticket was $25. The bureaucracy turned it into a $240 fine and a bench warrant. That's not justice. That's just a system that's forgotten how to ask the right questions. And with that, she pushed through the doors into the morning sunlight, leaving behind a courthouse full of people who would never again assume they knew someone's story just by looking at them. The courthouse erupted in controlled chaos the moment Elena's footsteps faded from the lobby. Judge Brennan immediately called for a recess in all proceedings, his voice carrying the authority of someone who just witnessed something that would change how he approached every case for the rest of his career. Court clerks huddled around computer terminals, frantically accessing databases and cross-referencing files, trying to understand how a decorated Navy SEAL had ended up processed like a common criminal. Mrs. Patterson, still shaken from her encounter with Admiral Thorne, was already on the phone with the courthouse administrator. "Sir, we have a situation. A Navy SEAL, officially killed in action, was just processed on a parking violation. We need to review our procedures immediately." Kowalski stood in the hallway, his earlier swagger replaced by something that looked like genuine shame. He'd spent 20 years in corrections, processing thousands of defendants, and he'd thought he'd developed a sixth sense for reading people. But Elena had completely shattered his confidence in his own judgment. "How do we fix this?" he asked Admiral Thorne, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't fix it," Thorne replied, his tone carrying the weight of experience. "You learn from it. You remember that every person who walks through these doors has a story you don't know, and you treat them accordingly." Lieutenant Commander Walsh was already drafting a report, her fingers flying across her laptop keyboard as she tried to capture the magnitude of what had just happened. But every sentence she wrote seemed inadequate to convey the reality of Elena's situation. A decorated war hero living in a shipping container, fighting bureaucracy instead of enemies, invisible to the very system she'd sworn to protect. "Admiral," Walsh said, looking up from her laptop, "what happened to her? After Yemen, I mean. How does someone like that end up ... like this?" Thorne's expression softened slightly. "PTSD, traumatic brain injury. The kind of wounds that don't show up on X-rays but never really heal. She was medically retired, classified as 100% disabled. But the system isn't designed for people like her." People like her? People who've seen too much, done too much, sacrificed too much. The bureaucracy knows how to process standard cases, but it doesn't know what to do with someone who's been officially dead for over a decade. So it defaults to treating them like everyone else. Meanwhile, Elena was walking across the parking lot toward her Honda, her mind already shifting focus to the 3-hour drive home. She'd gotten what she came for, the opportunity to file her paperwork, to satisfy the VA's requirements, to continue the endless dance of documentation that kept her disability benefits flowing. The drama in the courthouse was already fading from her attention, filed away in the same mental compartment where she stored all the other times her past had unexpectedly surfaced. But as she reached her car, a young clerk came hurrying after her, maybe 25 years old, nervous, still learning the job. "Ma'am," he called out, slightly out of breath. "Ma'am, wait." Elena turned, her hand already on the car door handle. "Yes?" The clerk held out a business card, his hands trembling slightly. "My mom works at the VA regional office. She said to tell you ... She said to tell you thank you." Elena took the card, looked at it for a moment, then tucked it into her pocket. "Thank you, ma'am." The clerk's voice was barely audible. Did you really save all those people?" Elena studied his face, seeing something there that reminded her of the young soldiers she'd watched over from rooftops in places where being young and American could get you killed. I did my job, just like you're doing yours. But what you did, that's not just a job. That's heroic. Hero is just a word people use when they don't understand what really happened. Elena's voice carried the weight of experience, of memories that couldn't be shared with someone who hadn't been there. I was a sniper. I watched people's backs. Sometimes I had to make hard choices. That's not heroic. That's just what the job required. The clerk nodded, though it was clear he didn't fully understand. As Elena drove away, he stood in the parking lot, watching her battered Honda disappear into traffic, carrying with it a story that would haunt him for years to come. Back inside the courthouse, the ripple effects were already beginning. Judge Brennan had called an emergency meeting with the courthouse administrator, demanding a complete review of their processing procedures. How many other veterans had been processed without anyone bothering to ask about their service? How many other heroes had been dismissed, diminished, treated like criminals instead of the people who'd sacrificed everything to keep the country safe? This can't happen again, Brennan said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd just learned a lesson he'd never forget. We need training. We need procedures. We need to make sure everyone who works in this building understands that the person standing in front of them might be someone who's already given more than we can imagine. And in the holding area where Elena had sat patiently waiting for the system to sort itself out, maintenance workers were already preparing to install a small plaque. It would read, "Remember, every person has a story. Ask before you judge." It wasn't much, but it was a start. 3 days after the courthouse incident, Elena was sitting on the small deck she'd built outside her shipping container home, watching the morning fog roll across the Monterey Hills when her phone rang. The number was blocked, but something about the timing made her answer. "Elena Briggs?" The voice was professional, controlled, with the kind of authority that came from years of making difficult decisions. "Speaking. This is Captain Rebecca Hayes, Navy Public Affairs. Admiral Thorne asked me to reach out to you regarding the incident at the courthouse. We'd like to discuss some options." Elena set down her coffee cup, her mind already calculating the implications. When the Navy started talking about options, it usually meant they wanted something. What kind of options? Well, there's been considerable interest in your story. The recognition you received, your service record, the circumstances of your retirement. We think there might be an opportunity here to highlight the sacrifices our veterans make, the challenges they face transitioning to civilian life. You want to use me for publicity. I want to honor your service. There's a difference. Hayes' voice carried genuine respect, but Elena had heard that tone before. It was the voice of someone who believed in what they were saying, even when what they were saying wasn't the whole truth. What would that involve? Interviews, maybe a documentary. The Navy Cross ceremony you never had because the operation was classified. A chance to tell your story on your terms, to help other veterans who might be struggling with similar challenges. Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching a red-tailed hawk circle over the valley below. She'd spent over a decade building a life of careful anonymity, of deliberate invisibility. The idea of stepping back into the spotlight, even for good reasons, felt like volunteering to walk into enemy territory. "Captain, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not interested in being anyone's poster child." "Ma'am, with respect, you already are. The story is out there. Social media, news outlets, veteran organizations. You can either let other people tell your story, or you can tell it yourself." The truth of that statement hit Elena like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on getting through the courthouse incident that she hadn't considered the aftermath. In an age where everything was documented, shared, and amplified, Her moment of recognition had already escaped her control. How bad is it? The video of Admiral Thorne's speech is approaching 2 million views. Hashtag Overwatch 7 is trending on multiple platforms. Veterans organizations are calling you a symbol of how the system fails our heroes. The courthouse has received over 10,000 phone calls demanding accountability. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of unwanted attention settling over her like a familiar burden. And if I don't cooperate, then other people will fill in the blanks. They'll make assumptions, create narratives, turn you into whatever story they want to tell. At least this way, you have some control over the message. It was a choice between being a willing participant in her own story or becoming a victim of everyone else's version of it. Elena had been making similar calculations. For over 20 years, weighing risks and benefits in situations where the wrong choice could mean death. This felt eerily similar. I need time to think, of course. But ma'am, the longer you wait, the less control you'll have over how this unfolds. After Hayes hung up, Elena sat on her deck for another hour, watching the fog burn off and reveal the valley below. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications she didn't bother to check. Reporters calling, veteran organizations reaching out, people who'd somehow tracked down her number, wanting to thank her, interview her, use her for their own purposes. The quiet life she'd built was already gone. The question now was what she wanted to build in its place. That afternoon, a convoy of cars pulled up the dirt road leading to her property. News vans, mostly, but also a few unmarked vehicles that Elena recognized as government issue. She watched from her deck as reporters set up cameras and officials in suits walked the perimeter of her friend's property, trying to determine how close they could get without trespassing. Her landlord, a gruff former Marine named Tommy Rodriguez, emerged from his main house and walked over to where the media was congregating. Elena couldn't hear the conversation, but his body language was clear. These people weren't welcome and they needed to leave. After 20 minutes of increasingly heated discussion, the convoy retreated to the main road, where they established what looked like a permanent encampment. Elena realized with growing dread that her anonymity wasn't just gone. It was never coming back. Her phone rang again. This time, the number wasn't blocked. Elena, this is Dr. Michael Carson from the VA Medical Center. I've been trying to reach you about your housing review. Dr. Carson, if this is about the media attention. Actually, it's not. Well, not directly. The review that triggered your courthouse visit? It's been expedited and resolved. Your housing situation has been approved. Your disability rating confirmed, and all pending documentation requirements have been waived. Elena felt a bitter laugh escape her throat. Let me guess. The Admiral made some phone calls. The Admiral, the Secretary of the Navy, 3 members of Congress, and approximately 50 veteran advocacy groups who've been calling our office every hour since yesterday. Your case has become what we call a high visibility priority, meaning you'll never have another problem with VA bureaucracy again. Also mean that every other veteran in the system is going to wonder why their cases aren't getting the same attention. The implications of that statement settled over Elena like a weight she'd carried before. Her individual problem had been solved, but in a way that highlighted the systemic issues facing thousands of other veterans. She'd become not just a symbol, but a reminder of everything that was wrong with the system she'd served. Dr. Carson, I appreciate the help, but this isn't what I wanted. I know, Elena, but sometimes what we want and what we get are 2 different things. The question is what we do with the hand we're dealt. As evening approached, Elena stood on her deck, watching the media encampment settle in for what looked like a long siege. Satellite trucks, generators, reporters doing live broadcasts against the backdrop of her mountain home. Her story was no longer her own. It belonged to the internet now, to the news cycle, to everyone who wanted to use it to make their own point about veterans. Bureaucracy, heroism, or the failure of the system to take care of its own. But as she watched the circus building around her quiet life, Elena made a decision. If her story was going to be told anyway, if her privacy was already gone, if her past was going to be dissected and analyzed and used for other people's purposes, then she was going to make sure it was told right. She picked up her phone and dialed Captain Hayes' number. "Captain, this is Elena Briggs. About those options you mentioned. Let's talk." 6 months later, Elena stood at a podium in the Pentagon's Hall of Heroes, wearing her dress blue uniform for the first time in over a decade. The fabric felt foreign against her skin. The weight of the ribbons and insignia, a reminder of a life she'd thought she'd left behind. Admiral Thorne stood beside her, while an audience of military personnel, government officials, and veterans, advocates filled the auditorium. The ceremony was being broadcast live, but this time, Elena had control over the narrative. She'd spent months working with Captain Hayes and a carefully selected team of documentarians to tell her story on her own terms. Not as a victim of bureaucratic indifference, but as an example of how the system could work when people cared enough to look beyond the surface. "Ladies and gentlemen," Admiral Thorne's voice carried across the auditorium, "today we correct an oversight that should have been addressed over a decade ago. Today, we honor not just Elena Briggs's service in combat, but her continued service as an advocate for veterans who've been forgotten by the system they served." The Navy Cross ceremony that followed was everything Elena had never wanted, and everything she'd never known she needed. As the medal was pinned to her uniform, she thought not of the building collapse in Yemen or the 43 lives she'd saved, but of the young clerk in the courthouse packing lot, of Mrs. Patterson learning to ask different questions, of Judge Brennan implementing new procedures to ensure veterans were recognized and respected. When it came time for her to speak, Elena approached the podium with the same calm presence she'd carried into every dangerous situation she'd ever faced. The audience fell silent, waiting for words that would capture the significance of the moment. "6 months ago, I walked into a courthouse to file paperwork," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium. "I was handcuffed, processed, and treated like every other defendant who'd failed to appear for a hearing. The system worked exactly as it was designed to work, and that's the problem." The audience stirred slightly, surprised by her directness. "I'm not here today because I'm special. I'm here because I got lucky. Lucky that Lieutenant Commander Walsh recognized marks that most people would never understand. Lucky that Admiral Thorne was willing to drive across town to set the record straight. Lucky that someone cared enough to ask who I really was." Elena paused, looking out at the faces in the audience. Military personnel, government officials, advocates, and reporters. People who had the power to change things if they chose to use it. But luck shouldn't be required for basic human dignity. Recognition shouldn't depend on viral videos and social media campaigns. Veterans shouldn't have to hope that someone in the system will care enough to look past their appearance, their circumstances, their paperwork, to see the person underneath. She gestured toward the medal now pinned to her uniform. "This honor belongs to every veteran who's been dismissed, diminished, or ignored by the very system they served. It belongs to every woman and man who sat in a government office, trying to prove they deserve the benefits they've already earned with their service." The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. "The courthouse incident changed my life, but it shouldn't have taken a Navy Cross and a classified service record to get people's attention. It should have been enough that I was a veteran asking for help. It should have been enough that I was a human being deserving of basic respect." Elena's voice carried the weight of experience, of years spent navigating a system that seemed designed to wear people down until they gave up trying. The real heroes aren't the people standing on stages receiving medals. They're the clerks who choose to ask one more question instead of processing another file. They're the judges who remember that everyone has a story worth hearing. They're the bureaucrats who see their job as helping people instead of just following procedures. She looked directly at the camera, knowing that her words would reach far beyond Pentagon auditorium. If you work in a government office, if you process veterans' claims, if you sit behind a desk where people come seeking help, remember that the person standing in front of you might be someone who's already given everything for their country. Don't make them prove their worth all over again. Just ask the right questions. Just care enough to look deeper. Just remember that heroes don't always look like what you expect them to look like. Elena stepped back from the podium to sustained applause, but her mind was already elsewhere. Tomorrow, she would return to her shipping container home in the Monterey Hills. She'd continue her work with veteran advocacy organizations, helping to implement the procedural changes that had grown out of her courthouse experience. She'd live with the media attention, the recognition, the loss of anonymity that came with becoming a symbol. But she'd also live with the knowledge that her story had made a difference. That courthouses across the country were implementing new training procedures. That government offices were learning to see veterans as individuals, rather than case numbers. That the system she'd served was slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely learning to serve her back. As the ceremony concluded and people began to file out of the auditorium, Elena caught sight of a familiar face in the crowd. The young courthouse clerk who'd given her his mother's business card, now wearing a Navy uniform, apparently inspired by their brief encounter to enlist himself. He approached her with the same nervous energy he'd shown in the parking lot, but his posture now carried the beginning of military bearing. "Mom," he said, coming to attention, "I wanted to thank you for showing me what service really looks like." Elena smiled, remembering the scared young man who chased her across a parking lot with a business card and a message from his mother. "You don't need to thank me. You just need to remember, everyone has a story. Ask before you judge." "Yes, ma'am." As he walked away, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not for herself, but for the system. For the possibility that change could happen one person at a time, one interaction at a time, one moment of recognition at a time. The parking ticket that had started it all had been $25. The bureaucracy had turned it into a $240 fine and a bench warrant. But in the end, it had become something else entirely. A catalyst for the kind of change that couldn't be measured in dollars or quantified in reports. Elena Briggs walked out of the Pentagon and into the Virginia sunshine, no longer invisible, no longer forgotten, but finally recognized for what she'd always been, a quiet hero who'd never stopped serving, even when the system had stopped seeing. The marks on her forearm were still there. 9 small reminders of lives saved rather than lives taken. But now they carried a different meaning. They were no longer just personal totems of service in distant places. They were symbols of a larger truth, that heroism isn't always loud or obvious or dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as staying calm under pressure, treating people with dignity, and remembering that everyone you meet is fighting a battle you know nothing about. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, the system learns to fight alongside you instead of against you. Sometimes, the quiet heroes finally get the recognition they never asked for but always deserved. Sometimes, justice isn't just served, it's learned, internalized, and passed on to the next person who walks through the door, looking for nothing more complicated than basic human respect. Elena drove home to her shipping container, to her quiet life in the hills, to her carefully constructed solitude. But now that solitude carried the weight of purpose, the knowledge that her story was helping to change how the country treated It's veterans, one courthouse at a time. And in government buildings across America, clerks were learning to ask different questions. Judges were remembering to look deeper, and bureaucrats were discovering that sometimes the most important part of their job wasn't following procedures. It was recognizing the humanity in every person who asked for their help. The fog rolled in from Monterey Bay, but for the first time in years, Elena wasn't hiding in it. She was simply home, at peace with her past, present, and the future she'd helped to build. Ever wonder how many heroes are sitting quietly in courtrooms, DMV offices, and government buildings, just trying to navigate the same bureaucracy as everyone else? How many times have you seen someone treated poorly and assumed they deserved it? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story made you think twice about judging someone by their appearance, remember, everyone has a story worth hearing. Sometimes we just need to care enough to ask the right questions. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.